Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Today's story is all about love, betrayal, and heartache. If you've ever wondered what happens when a perfect relationship unravels, this one's for you. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Part 1. The Unseen Cracks. Thomas and Ellen had always been the picture of a stable, happy couple. Married for almost 30 years, their lives were built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and deep love for each other. They raised 2 children who were now grown and living their own lives, and had both carved out successful careers. Their house, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was the home they had spent years making their own. The familiar sights and sounds of their lives together should have felt comforting, but lately, there had been something in the air, a quiet tension that neither of them had addressed. Thomas, a lawyer, had always been meticulous about his work. He spent long hours in the office, often coming home late in the evenings. Ellen, on the other hand, had been a stay-at-home mom for many years before returning to teaching at a local school. While she had always supported Thomas's demanding career, something had shifted. She didn't seem as excited about life as she once had. At first, Thomas chalked it up to the empty nest syndrome, or maybe the stress of her job as a teacher, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Tonight, like many nights, Thomas returned home after a particularly grueling day at the office. The sky was dark, and the chill in the air told him winter was already creeping in. He opened the door, expecting the familiar warmth of their home, but instead, he was met with an unsettling quiet. Ellen was in the kitchen preparing dinner, as she had done for so many years, but something about her was different. Her back was slightly hunched as she chopped vegetables, and her movements were slower than usual, almost mechanical. "Hi, honey," Thomas said, trying to sound upbeat as he dropped his briefcase by the door. Ellen glanced over her shoulder and smiled faintly. "Hi, Thomas. How was your day?" "Busy. But I'm glad to be home," he replied, taking off his coat and hanging it up. He walked toward the kitchen, his steps slow as he noticed the distance in her voice. It was like she was physically there, but mentally, she had already retreated somewhere else. "Everything okay?" Thomas asked gently, leaning against the counter. He could tell something was off, but he wasn't sure how to approach it. "Yeah, just tired," Ellen responded, her eyes briefly meeting his before quickly looking down again, her focus shifting back to the vegetables in front of her. Thomas couldn't remember the last time she had looked at him like that, without the warmth and affection that used to come so naturally. He noticed her posture was slouched, as though the weight of something was bearing down on her. It wasn't like Ellen to be distant. She had always been the heart of their home, the one who brought lightness and joy to their family life. Over the years, they had settled into a comfortable routine, nothing too exciting but stable. And that stability had always been enough for them, or so Thomas thought. Dinner was a quiet affair. There was no joking, no stories about the kids, no laughter, just the soft clinking of silverware against plates and the occasional murmur of, "Pass the salt." Thomas tried to make small talk, asking about Ellen's day, but her responses were brief, almost mechanical. There were no longer any of the little moments that once made their evenings special. No more shared glances, no more knowing smiles. When dinner was finished, Ellen cleared the table without a word, and Thomas lingered for a moment, watching her. He wanted to ask again if something was wrong, but he hesitated. Every time he did, she brushed it off with a smile, telling him it was nothing, that she was just tired. But tonight, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his chest. "Ellen, are you sure everything is okay?" Thomas asked softly, his voice laced with concern. "You've been distant lately." Ellen paused, her hand hovering over the dishes. She turned slowly to face him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something Thomas couldn't quite place, but it wasn't the warmth he was used to. Instead, there was a hint of defensiveness, of withdrawal. "I'm fine, Thomas." "Really?" she replied quickly, almost too quickly. "I'm just tired, that's all." Thomas knew it was a lie. He could feel it, but he didn't press further. Instead, he let it go, retreating to his favorite chair in the living room, as he had done on so many nights before. He flipped through a few pages of a book, trying to distract himself, but his mind kept drifting back to Ellen. What was happening? Why was she pulling away? And most importantly, why couldn't she talk to him about it? As the evening wore on, Ellen excused herself early, citing a headache. Thomas didn't question her. He had learned over the years that sometimes Ellen needed her space. He sat there in the living room, the quiet settling around him like a blanket. His thoughts became increasingly restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them, but he couldn't figure out what it was. After a while, Thomas stood up and walked to the stairs, pausing outside their bedroom. He could hear the soft sound of Ellen moving around inside, and though he wanted to go in, to hold her, to ask her to tell him what was wrong, something held him back. There was a hesitation in the air, a distance that wasn't just physical but emotional. It was as if something had been slowly eroding the foundation of their marriage, and neither of them knew how to stop it. That night, as he lay in bed next to her, the silence between them was deafening. Thomas reached out, brushing his hand against Ellen's, but she didn't respond. Her body was turned away from him, a quiet wall that seemed to separate them. In the years they had been together, this was the first time Thomas felt a sense of complete disconnect. It was like she was miles away, even though she was lying right beside him. The following morning, Thomas awoke to the sound of Ellen moving around the house. She was already up, making breakfast, but there was no usual warmth in her movements. No hum of a song under her breath. No gentle teasing about what he wanted for breakfast. Just silence. It was in the way she moved, the way she didn't meet his eyes. Thomas sat down at the kitchen table, watching her as she placed a plate of eggs in front of him. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could ask the question that had been lingering on his mind, Ellen spoke. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I think I need some time. I've been feeling lost lately," she admitted quietly, avoiding his gaze as she sat down across from him. Her words hit him like a wave crashing against rocks. Lost? What did she mean by that? Thomas didn't know what to say. He wanted to reach out, to reassure her, but he was paralyzed by the uncertainty of her words. Time for what? Was she unhappy with their life? With him? The silence stretched between them again. But this time it was different. This time, it wasn't just the quiet of a comfortable, settled home. It was the silence of something fragile, something about to break. Part 2. The beginning of the end. The days following Ellen's admission felt like a heavy weight pressing down on Thomas. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers, something he couldn't quite grasp. Ellen had always been the center of their life together. Her laughter, her warmth, the way she would light up any room she walked into. But now, it felt as if she were a shadow of the woman he had married. Thomas tried to act normal, trying to focus on his work and daily routines, but everything felt different. The house, which once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed empty and cold. Ellen was still there, physically but emotionally, she was distant. There were moments when Thomas would catch her staring out the window, lost in thought, or when she would disappear into the bedroom for hours without a word. It was as if she was retreating into herself, and he was left outside, helpless to understand why. They hadn't talked about what Ellen had said the other morning. "I'm lost," she had whispered, but it was the kind of statement that begged for more explanation, one Thomas couldn't get out of her. He had tried asking her more questions, but each time she would simply shrug it off, saying that it was nothing. She would smile weakly, kiss him on the cheek, and then retreat into the quiet spaces of their home. And so life went on like this. For the first time in years, their conversations had become strained, with long silences between them. Even the small talk, the things they once enjoyed discussing, how their children were doing, plans for the next vacation, what they wanted for dinner, had all become topics that were too difficult to discuss. What had happened to them? What had happened to their love? Then one evening, just after dinner, Thomas found himself in the living room, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. when he heard the sound of Ellen crying in the other room. The sobs were quiet at first, like the sound of someone trying to stifle their pain. But then, as the minutes ticked by, the sobs grew louder, more desperate. He dropped his phone and rushed toward the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Ellen sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. Her body shook with every sob, and her shoulders heaved with the weight of something unsaid. Thomas felt his own heart break as he stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. This wasn't just the woman he had married. It was a woman in pain, a woman whose grief he couldn't comprehend. "Ellen?" he whispered, taking a hesitant step toward her. "What's going on? Please, talk to me." She looked up at him then, her eyes swollen and red from crying. But there was no anger or defensiveness in her gaze, only exhaustion. She looked like she had been carrying this burden alone for far too long. "I can't, Thomas," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to fix me." Thomas knelt in front of her, gently taking her hands into his. He could feel her tremble beneath his touch, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he held her hands tightly, trying to offer her some comfort. "Ellen, please," he said, his voice trembling. "Tell me what's going on. We've been through so much together. You don't have to carry this alone." For a moment, Ellen said nothing, and Thomas thought maybe she wouldn't speak at all. But then, slowly, she began to tell him everything. She spoke in halting sentences, her voice trembling as she confessed the weight of her own fears and self-doubt. "I feel like I've lost myself, Thomas," she said, wiping her eyes. "I don't even know who I am anymore. I've been so focused on being a wife, a mother, and a teacher that I've forgotten about me. I don't feel like I'm enough for you anymore." Thomas was stunned. He had always known that Ellen was a strong woman, that she had always carried the weight of their family on her shoulders with grace. But to hear her say that she didn't feel enough hit him harder than anything else she could have said. He realized, for the first time, that Ellen had been carrying this weight for a long time, quietly suffering in a way that he hadn't seen. "Ellen," he whispered, his voice full of empathy, "you are more than enough. You've always been enough for me." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But I don't feel that way anymore. I feel lost. I don't know how to be the woman you need me to be anymore. And I'm scared. I'm scared you won't want me once you see how broken I am." Thomas's heart ached as he listened to her. He had no idea that she had been battling these feelings in silence. He had always known Ellen to be strong, self-assured, someone who could hold it all together no matter what came her way. But now, he saw her vulnerability for the first time, and it broke him to realize how much she had been hiding. "Ellen, you don't have to be perfect," he said gently. "You don't have to carry the weight of everything on your own. I'm here, and I love you. I've always loved you, no matter what." For the first time in months, Thomas saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. She didn't speak, but her body softened slightly as she allowed herself to lean into him, accepting the comfort he offered. But even in that moment, as they sat there together, Thomas couldn't ignore the feeling that something was still off. Ellen's confession about feeling lost was just the beginning. It was clear that she was still holding something back, something deeper that she wasn't ready to share. Part 3. The Quiet Before the Storm. The days following Ellen's emotional confession were a delicate balancing act for Thomas. He wanted to believe that things were beginning to improve, that the air between them was clearing. He had no idea how deep Ellen's feelings of inadequacy and loss truly went, but he had promised her that they would work through it together. In many ways, the raw honesty of their conversation had given him hope. But in the days that followed, he noticed something else, something that filled him with both suspicion and unease. Despite the promises they had made to each other, Ellen seemed to retreat into herself once again. There was no longer any outward display of affection, no more shared laughter or quiet conversations. The space between them remained, like an invisible wall, and no matter how hard Thomas tried to bridge that gap, it seemed to widen every day. At first, he attributed this to Ellen's struggles, her need for time and space to figure things out. He understood that healing wasn't immediate, and he had no intention of rushing her. But over time, his own patience began to wear thin. Every time he reached out, she pulled away a little more. Every time he tried to talk, she responded with the same deflection, the same vague assurances that everything was fine. Then, one Friday evening, as Thomas was coming home from work, he arrived to a quiet house. It was a familiar scene by now. Ellen, having finished her day, was already in the kitchen or tucked away in the living room, reading. But tonight was different. The silence in the house felt heavier. There was something about the atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of Thomas's neck stand up. He entered the house, his steps slow as he called out, "Ellen." No response. He walked through the house, checking each room, and then stopped in front of their bedroom door. The faint sound of a phone ringing echoed through the walls. Ellen's phone, he realized. The fact that she hadn't answered her phone or responded to him was strange, even for her. Pushing open the door slightly, Thomas's eyes fell on Ellen's phone lying on the bedside table. The screen was glowing, illuminated by a recent message. Without thinking, Thomas stepped into the room. His heart began to beat faster, his curiosity getting the better of him. He glanced at the phone, and in that moment his stomach sank. There, on the screen, was the name David. It wasn't just a message from a friend, but a thread of ongoing texts. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as he read a few lines. "David, I miss you so much. Can't stop thinking about you. Ellen, I shouldn't be doing this, but I can't help myself." The air in the room grew thick, and a cold rush swept over Thomas. He wanted to look away, but the words burned in his mind. His heart felt as though it had dropped to his stomach. The weight of betrayal pressed on him, each word a deeper wound. David? Who was David? Thomas couldn't recall ever hearing that name before. And now it seemed like Ellen had been hiding something that she had failed to mention in their conversations. She had promised him that she would share what was on her mind, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. In a daze, he picked up the phone and opened the message thread. The messages were flirtatious and personal, full of longing and desire. The texts were intimate in a way that Thomas couldn't ignore. And there, at the very end of the thread, was a photo, a picture of Ellen's smile, her face lit with what seemed to be excitement, or was it guilt? The photo had been sent just a few hours ago. Thomas's hands trembled as he put the phone back on the table. His mind raced with thoughts, memories of their life together, the promises, the love they had shared. He had trusted her. He had trusted Ellen with his heart. But now everything felt like it was crumbling. Everything he had believed in seemed to be slipping away in an instant. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone, unable to process what had just unfolded before him. The familiar warmth of their home had disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming feeling of betrayal. He had no idea what to do next. Should he confront her? Should he wait for her to come clean on her own? Before he could make up his mind, he heard Ellen's footsteps approaching. The door to their bedroom creaked open, and there she stood, her expression soft but wary. "Thomas?" Ellen's voice trembled slightly, and Thomas could see the anxiety in her eyes. "What are you doing in here?" Thomas looked at her, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and hurt. He didn't speak at first. He couldn't bring himself to say the words. Instead, he simply pointed to her phone, lying innocently on the table. Ellen froze. Her eyes darted to the phone, and for a moment, Thomas could see the change in her expression. The color drained from her face, and her lips parted in shock. She knew. She knew what he had seen. I can explain," she whispered, her voice cracking. Thomas shook his head, his thoughts swirling in 1,000 directions. He felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what came next. "You can explain?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "How do you explain this, Ellen? How do you explain David?" Ellen's face crumpled as the truth slowly unfolded. Her eyes filled with tears, but there was no turning back now. "I'm so sorry, Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, but it did. I was looking for something I felt I was missing. And I found it in him." Part 4, the truth comes crashing down. Thomas stood frozen, staring at Ellen, trying to process her words. "I found it in him." Those words echoed in his mind, but no matter how hard he tried to understand them, they made no sense. He had always believed that his marriage to Ellen was solid. Their love had been one of mutual respect, shared experiences, and, above all, trust. And yet here she was, telling him that she had sought something from someone else. He couldn't breathe. The words had hit him harder than anything else ever could. He had always thought he could handle anything life threw at him, but this was different. "Ellen," he finally whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't understand. Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you talk to me about whatever it was you were feeling?" His voice cracked with the weight of his emotions. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as if trying to hold onto something, anything that would stop the pain. Ellen's face was pale now, her tears streaming down uncontrollably. She shook her head, her hands reaching for Thomas, but he stepped back. She faltered, a look of deep regret clouding her features. "I don't know. I thought I could fix it myself, Thomas. I thought I could find something that would make me feel alive again. But I was wrong. I was selfish. I betrayed you." Her words were filled with anguish, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to comfort her. Not yet. He needed answers. He needed the truth. "So, this man, David?" Thomas asked, his voice quieter now, but still raw with hurt. "How long has this been going on? How many times have you been with him?" Ellen closed her eyes, unable to answer at first. She couldn't look him in the eyes anymore. "It's been a few months now. It started with just talking. He was there for me when I felt alone. When you were working late, when we stopped connecting. It just happened." Thomas felt his chest tighten. He had always known that their lives had been different in the past few months. But this, he had never seen it coming. "How could you do this to us, Ellen?" His voice broke, the pain in his heart now overwhelming. "You know how much I love you. You know how much I've given to this marriage. And you go to him?" Ellen collapsed onto the bed, her body shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. I never meant for it to go this far. I should have talked to you. I should have been honest, but I was scared. So scared that you'd stop loving me. I felt like I was losing myself, and I didn't know how to fix it. David made me feel seen, Thomas. He made me feel like I mattered again." Thomas looked at her, his chest tight, but he was also filled with a strange sense of anger. Anger at her betrayal, yes, but also at himself for not seeing the signs earlier. For not being there when she needed him most. He had been so focused on his work, his career, thinking that everything would be okay because they had been together for so long. But the truth hit him now. He had missed something important. Something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I've given everything to this marriage, Ellen," Thomas said softly, his voice full of pain. "And I thought you were happy. I thought we were happy. But you've been hiding something from me. For months." Ellen wiped her face with the back of her hand, looking up at him with a mixture of guilt and despair. "I never wanted to hurt you, Thomas. I swear I didn't. But I was so lost. And when I met him, he made me feel alive again. I didn't know how to handle it." The silence between them hung thick in the air, the weight of her confession crushing both of them. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling as he tried to process everything. This wasn't just about Ellen's affair. It was about the cracks in their relationship, the things they had failed to address before they became too big to ignore. He had spent so many years working hard, thinking that love and security would be enough. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten about the need for connection. And now it was too late. "Is it over with him?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellen's eyes filled with more tears as she nodded. "Yes, it's over. It was a mistake, Thomas. Terrible, awful mistake. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I'm here now. I want to fix this. If you'll let me." Thomas looked at her, the pain in his heart still sharp, but he could feel the anger slowly ebbing away. The betrayal still stung, but there was a part of him that couldn't give up on everything they had built. They had been through so much together. Good times, bad times, everything in between. Could he really just throw all of that away? "I don't know, Ellen," he said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. But I'm willing to try. If you're willing to try too." Ellen looked at him, her eyes wide with relief and fear. "I'll do whatever it takes, Thomas. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make this right. I love you, and I'm so sorry." They sat in silence, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Thomas wasn't sure what would come next. He wasn't sure if they could ever fully heal from this. But for the first time in what felt like a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope, a small, fragile thread of possibility. Could they rebuild? Could their marriage survive this betrayal? He didn't know. But for now, he was willing to try. For the sake of everything they had shared, for the sake of their history, he would give it one last chance. Part 5: The Struggle to Rebuild. The days following that heart-wrenching conversation were filled with an eerie quiet. Thomas couldn't decide whether he should feel relieved or more confused than ever. He had listened to Ellen's tears, watched as she pleaded for his forgiveness, and promised that she would do whatever it took to rebuild their shattered marriage. But even as she spoke, he could feel the doubt swirling in his mind. He couldn't ignore the lingering feeling that something in their relationship had been irreparably broken. The first few days after the confrontation were the hardest. Ellen had tried to talk to him, really talk, but he wasn't ready to hear it. He needed time. He needed space. The distance between them, once so comfortable, now felt suffocating. He couldn't shake the images of her texting David, the words she had sent him. The way Ellen had let someone else fill a void in her heart when he was supposed to be the one she turned to. Ellen did her best to give Thomas the space he needed. She didn't want to push him further away, but every day felt like a struggle. She spent hours on the couch, staring out the window, wondering if she would ever be able to undo the damage she had done. She had broken his trust, and no amount of apology or remorse could take that back. Thomas spent his evenings walking around the neighborhood, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. He would look at the house they had built, the memories they had shared, and wonder if they could ever return to the life they had before. The love they had once shared felt so pure, so unbreakable. But now? Now it felt like an illusion. Everything felt tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. As the week went on, Ellen's presence in the house became a silent reminder of the rift between them. She tried to make things normal, she cooked dinner, she cleaned, she even made the bed like she used to, but Thomas couldn't pretend that everything was fine. He couldn't bring himself to smile at her the way he used to. And though he had told her he was willing to try, he couldn't shake the feeling that the damage was too deep to heal. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas found himself sitting in the living room. Ellen was in the kitchen, preparing a quiet meal for them. The house was unusually still, and the silence between them hung like a cloud in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thomas spoke. "Ellen," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need to know if you're really committed to fixing this. I need to know if you're willing to do the hard work to rebuild what we've lost. Because, right now, I'm not sure I can even look at you without seeing what you did." Ellen paused, her hands freezing in the middle of chopping vegetables. She hadn't expected him to speak first, but now that he had, she felt a pang of guilt rush over her. "I want to fix this," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I know it's not going to be easy, and I know I've lost your trust, but I'll do whatever it takes. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even explain, but I love you, Thomas. I want to try." Thomas looked at her, his eyes full of pain. He could see the sincerity in her face, the depth of her remorse, but that didn't change the fact that something had broken between them. He needed time, more time to process everything, more time to figure out if he could ever trust her again. "I need you to be patient with me," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now. I don't know if I can ever forget this. But I don't want to just give up on us. I think I need to understand why it happened, why you did what you did." Ellen nodded, her face pale. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. It would take time, it would take vulnerability, and it would take painful honesty. But she was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. "I understand, Thomas," she replied, her voice barely audible. "And I'm willing to be honest with you. I'll answer any questions you have, no matter how hard they are. I want you to see that I'm trying." Thomas nodded slowly, but his mind was still swirling. There was still so much they hadn't talked about. So much that was left unsaid. And for the first time in his life, Thomas wondered if their love, their decades-long bond, was strong enough to withstand the weight of this betrayal. The next few weeks were a blur of difficult conversations, painful confessions, and emotional exhaustion. Ellen was completely transparent, answering every question Thomas had, no matter how uncomfortable. But with every answer, with every truth revealed, the gap between them seemed to widen. The trust that had been broken felt impossible to rebuild. Thomas found himself torn between the man he had been, the one who believed in their love, and the man he was becoming, the one who no longer saw Ellen in the same light. As much as he wanted to forgive her, to move past this and salvage their relationship, he found himself doubting everything. Could he ever look at her without feeling the sting of betrayal? Could they ever return to the life they once shared? And Ellen, though filled with regret and remorse, began to question her own choices. She had spent so long trying to find validation from someone else that she had neglected the love and connection she once shared with Thomas. But no matter how hard she tried to make it right, she couldn't take back the time they had lost or the hurt she had caused. Days turned into weeks. and Thomas and Ellen found themselves on opposite ends of the same house, both yearning for something they couldn't quite name. Their love, once so strong, now felt fragile. Fragile in the face of betrayal and the long road to healing. One evening, as Thomas sat in the living room, he made a decision. He had to know if they could ever find their way back to each other. It was time for a final conversation. A conversation that would either make or break their future together. Part 6. The Final Confrontation. The quiet that had settled in their home felt suffocating to Thomas. Every moment that passed was filled with tension, and the weight of what had happened between them hung in the air like an unspoken word, waiting to be said. The fragility of their marriage was undeniable now. Every glance between them, every word spoken, seemed to come with an undercurrent of doubt. Thomas could no longer ignore the questions that plagued him, questions that had no easy answers. He spent hours lying awake at night, replaying the same scenes in his mind. Ellen's tears, her apology, her confession, the weight of her betrayal, and, perhaps the most painful of all, the realization that a part of him would never look at her the same way again. But he still loved her. That much hadn't changed. He still cared for the woman who had stood by his side for nearly 30 years, who had shared in all the joys and hardships of their life together. How could he just throw it all away? Could he really give up on everything they had built? Could he let her go, or was there a chance, just a small chance, that they could rebuild? He couldn't find an answer. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, silent as usual, Thomas could feel the weight of the conversation that was about to happen. He had decided it was time. Time for a final confrontation. He had asked Ellen to meet him after dinner, and although she didn't know it yet, this conversation would either bring them closer or push them further apart. "Ellen," Thomas began, his voice low but firm, "I can't keep pretending that everything's okay. It's not. You know it and I know it. We've been through hell these past few weeks, and I can't keep going like this. I need to know if you really want to fix this. I need to know if you're ready to fight for us, for our marriage, or if we're just prolonging the inevitable." Ellen set her fork down, her eyes widening at the sharpness in his tone. She had expected this conversation to happen sooner or later, but hearing it now, hearing the raw honesty in his voice, made it real. "I am ready, Thomas," she said softly, her voice shaky. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to fix this. I want to make it right. I know I hurt you in a way that I can never take back. But I love you, and I want to prove that to you." Thomas stared at her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. He wanted to believe her. He truly did. But the truth was that the pain of her betrayal had already carved deep scars in his heart. No matter how much he tried to move forward, no matter how much he tried to forgive her, there was something that kept him from fully trusting her again. Something that made him feel like they were living in two separate worlds. One where they were once deeply in love, and one where that love was now tainted by betrayal. "You say you want to fix it," Thomas said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to know. Can you really be honest with me? Can you give me everything? Or are you still holding something back? Because every time I think we're getting somewhere, I feel like I'm losing you more and more. I need to know the truth, Ellen. All of it." Ellen's breath caught in her throat. She could see the pain in his eyes, and it made her heart ache. She had known this day would come, the day when Thomas would ask for the truth. The real truth. She had held on to so much, kept so much buried inside, because she didn't know how to tell him. But now, as she faced him, she realized that the only way forward was to come clean. She owed him that much. They both deserved that much. "I've been hiding something, Thomas," Ellen said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not just the affair with David. There's something deeper I've been keeping from you. It's not an excuse, but it's the reason I did what I did." Thomas felt his chest tighten as he listened. His breath caught in his throat, and he found himself bracing for whatever she was about to say. Could it possibly get worse? Was there more to this than he already knew? "I've felt invisible for so long," Ellen continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been so caught up in being a mother, a wife, a teacher, that I forgot about who I am. I felt like I was losing myself, like I was just going through the motions. And when David started paying attention to me, when he made me feel seen, I didn't know how to stop. It wasn't about him, Thomas. It was about me. It was about the part of me that I had ignored for so long. The part of me that I thought was gone forever. And when I found that, when I felt that, I couldn't let it go. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always known that something deeper was at play, something beyond just the affair. But hearing it now, hearing her admit it, made him feel both heartbroken and conflicted. He stood up, pacing across the room as he tried to process everything. His mind was spinning. He had always believed that the core of their problems was external work, the kids, the distance that naturally came with the years. But this was something much deeper. This was about identity, about self-worth. And now, he had to decide if he could forgive Ellen for seeking validation outside of their marriage. "Ellen," Thomas said after a long pause, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't know if I can forgive you for what you've done. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. But I also don't know if I'm ready to give up on us. I love you. I still love you. And I'm willing to try, but it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of time." Ellen nodded, tears filling her eyes. She had no illusions about what she had done. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. She knew that this wasn't just about her mistake. It was about everything they had neglected, everything they had ignored, and the trust that had been shattered. "I'll wait, Thomas," she said quietly, her voice filled with both sorrow and determination. "I'll wait as long as it takes, because I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. He needed time to think, to process the truth, and to figure out whether they could truly rebuild what had been broken. But one thing was clear. This conversation, this moment, had marked a turning point. He didn't know if they would make it through, but for the first time in weeks, he felt the possibility of a future together. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. Part 7. A Fragile Hope. The days that followed the confrontation were some of the hardest moments in Thomas's life. He had come to terms with the fact that things would never be the same, but part of him, perhaps the part that still loved Ellen more than anything, clung to a fragile hope that they could rebuild. After everything that had happened, after the lies and the hurt, it felt almost impossible to imagine a future with her. But the love they shared, the years they had spent together, kept him from walking away. Ellen, for her part, was doing everything she could to prove that she was serious about rebuilding their trust. She had started seeing a therapist to address the deep-seated issues of self-worth that had led to her affair. She had apologized again and again, each time with the same sincerity in her voice, but Thomas couldn't ignore the nagging voice inside him that told him to be cautious. She had said she was sorry, and she was taking the steps to fix things, but was that enough? Was she enough? Their home, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a battlefield, each room filled with the echoes of their past arguments and unspoken pain. The house was quiet at night. The laughter that had once filled the halls was gone, replaced by tense silences. Even their bed felt different. Ellen still slept beside him, but it was no longer the same. They no longer held each other at night, no longer shared the simple comfort of being in each other's arms. Every night, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if their love could ever truly be restored. Ellen, too, lay awake in the darkness, her mind racing. She had never felt so lost, so deeply ashamed of what she had done. She had hurt Thomas in a way she could never undo, and the guilt was almost unbearable. Every time she looked at him, she saw the pain in his eyes. She saw the man she had once trusted with everything. His love, his devotion, his heart, and she realized just how much she had betrayed him. But she was willing to do whatever it took to prove to him that she could be the woman he deserved. She loved him more than anything, and the fear of losing him forever was the only thing that kept her going. One afternoon, Thomas came home early from work. He had decided to take a walk to clear his head. As he entered the house, he was greeted by a strange stillness. Ellen was sitting on the couch, her eyes puffy from crying, her hands clenched in her lap. The sight of her filled him with a strange mix of anger and sadness. But there was something else there, too. Something softer, something that still held on to the hope they both had, however fragile it might be. She looked up when he entered the room, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was thick and heavy, filled with all the things they hadn't said yet. Ellen opened her mouth to speak, but Thomas held up his hand. "I'm not here to argue," Thomas said, his voice soft but firm. I need to know if this is real. I need to know if you're truly committed to changing. I can't keep going through this, Ellen. I can't keep waiting for things to get better if you're not ready to change." Ellen nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know I've hurt you, Thomas, and I don't blame you for not trusting me. I've made mistakes, big ones, but I'm trying. I've been trying every day to be a better person. I'm seeing someone to work through my issues. I know it won't fix everything, but it's a start." Thomas sat down on the couch beside her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt, any trace of the woman who had betrayed him so deeply. But what he saw in her eyes was only pain, regret, and a desperate desire to make things right. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said slowly, turning to face her. "About us trying to rebuild. About whether we can even fix what's broken. And the truth is, I don't know. I don't know if we can ever get back to where we were. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to fight for us if you are." Ellen's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say that. She had feared that he had already made up his mind, that he would walk away from her, from their life together. But hearing him say those words, hearing him acknowledge that there might still be a chance, gave her the tiniest sliver of hope. "I'm willing, Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll fight for us too. I don't want to lose you." Thomas looked at her, his eyes softening. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers gently. "I know this won't be easy. I know it's going to take time. And I can't promise you that everything will be okay right away. But I'm willing to try. For you. For us." For a moment, they sat there in silence, their hands intertwined. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a moment of honesty, of vulnerability. It was a small step forward in a long journey that neither of them could predict. But as they sat there, both of them uncertain of what the future held, one thing was clear. They were both committed to trying. They had a long road ahead of them, one filled with difficult conversations, moments of doubt, and the painful task of rebuilding trust. But for the first time in a long time, they both felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Part 8. The Road Ahead. The following weeks felt like an emotional roller coaster for both Thomas and Ellen. They had made progress, small, incremental steps, but they both knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. The house, once filled with an unmistakable warmth, now felt like a place of both hope and hesitation. There were moments when everything seemed perfect again, when they could laugh together and share their thoughts without the heavy weight of the past hovering over them. But then, there were the quiet moments, the moments when they would catch each other's gaze and remember what had happened, the betrayal, the uncertainty. It was hard to ignore, and it wasn't something that could be erased with a few kind words or a heartfelt promise. Ellen, for her part, was doing everything she could to show Thomas that she was committed to their marriage. She had continued her therapy, worked through her feelings of inadequacy and guilt, and tried to reconnect with him in a way that was genuine. She knew that she couldn't change the past, but she hoped that her efforts would be enough to prove to Thomas that she was truly remorseful, that she was ready to rebuild the life they had once shared. But no matter how hard she tried, there were moments when the doubt crept in. Thomas's behavior had shifted. He was more guarded now, his eyes always searching for any signs of deception, any reason to pull away from her. It wasn't that he didn't want to trust her again. It was that he didn't know if he could. His mind and heart were torn between the love he still had for her and the betrayal he couldn't quite forget. One evening, as they sat in their living room, Thomas glanced over at Ellen. The silence between them was comfortable, but there was still a sense of tension, a feeling that neither of them could fully relax. Ellen had suggested they watch one of their old favorite movies, something they used to do often, But tonight it felt different. It wasn't just about the movie. It was about the fact that they were both trying to pretend that things were normal. Ellen turned toward him, her eyes searching his face. "How do you feel, Thomas? I know we've been through a lot, but are we getting closer to where we need to be?" Thomas paused for a moment before answering, his mind processing her question carefully. He had asked himself that very same thing many times in the past few weeks. How could he know if they were on the right path? How could he trust that they were moving forward and not just in circles, trapped in the past? "I don't know," he said quietly, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I want to believe we're getting there. I want to believe that we can fix this. But sometimes, Ellen, I still feel like I don't know who you are anymore. I can see the changes in you. I know you're trying, but there's something that's not the same. And it scares me." Ellen felt a sharp pang in her chest at his words. She knew the truth of what he was saying, and it hurt. She wasn't the same woman he had married. She had allowed herself to slip away, and in doing so, had allowed their marriage to slip into a place where trust had been broken beyond repair. She knew that no matter how many times she said she was sorry, no matter how much she worked to fix herself, it might never be enough to heal the wounds she had caused. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I'm still here trying to be the woman you need. And I'm willing to keep fighting for us, no matter how long it takes." Thomas didn't respond right away. He was staring at the floor, his hand resting on his knee. For a brief moment, he thought about everything they had been through. The years they had spent building their life together, the children they had raised, the memories they had created. And now it felt like it was all slipping away, like everything he had trusted had been turned upside down in an instant. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Ellen," he finally said, his voice full of frustration and sadness. "I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything's okay when I'm still haunted by what happened. I love you, but I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you." Ellen's heart sank at his words, but she didn't look away. "I understand, Thomas. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were, but I'm asking for a chance. A chance to prove that I'm not the person I was before. A chance to show you that I can be the woman you deserve." Thomas looked at her, his gaze softening, but there was still a deep sadness in his eyes. "I need time, Ellen. Time to figure out if we can move past this. Time to see if we can find a way back to each other." Ellen nodded. She knew that this was the hardest part. The waiting, the uncertainty, the not knowing if things would ever be the same again. But she also knew that love, true love, was worth fighting for. And if Thomas was willing to try, then so was she. The days that followed were a blur of small moments. Thomas and Ellen didn't jump back into the life they once had. There were no grand gestures, no romantic dinners or whispered promises of forever. Instead, they spent their time together cautiously, slowly rebuilding their connection. They had dinner together most nights, but the conversations were quieter now. The laughter that used to fill their home was rare, but there was still a sense of shared history, a sense that, despite everything, they were both still holding on to something that was worth saving. But as the days turned into weeks, the question still hung in the air. Could they truly rebuild what had been broken? Or would the scar of betrayal remain, a mark on their marriage that would never fade? Part 9. The End of the Road. As weeks turned into months, Thomas and Ellen slowly found their rhythm again. The days of silence had become fewer, and the moments of genuine connection, though still fragile, began to take root. But they both knew it would never be the same. The foundation of their marriage had been shattered, and it would take more than time to fully heal. Thomas had begun to trust her again, but there was always a lingering doubt in the back of his mind. The emotional scars would never fully disappear, and while he could forgive her, he wasn't sure if he could ever forget. Ellen, for her part, continued to work on herself, attending therapy and doing everything she could to make up for her mistakes. She had realized, perhaps too late, that the woman she had been before, lost, seeking validation from others, wasn't the woman she wanted to be anymore. One evening, after a long day, Thomas and Ellen sat on the porch together, looking out at the setting sun. The peaceful silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just the quiet of two people who had come through a storm together. They had survived, but they were both forever changed by it. I don't know if we can go back to what we were. Thomas? Ellen said softly, her voice gentle but filled with the weight of everything they had been through. But I want to keep moving forward. With you. I'm ready to keep trying. I'm ready to spend the rest of my life showing you that I can be the person you need. Thomas turned to her, his expression softer now, though his eyes still held the pain of the past. I'm willing to try too, Ellen. But I think we both know that it will never be easy. We'll always have this scar. But I think we can still build something. Something new. They sat in silence for a long while, the sun dipping below the horizon. It was quiet, peaceful. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt a sense of hope. Maybe they couldn't go back to the way things were, but perhaps they could build a future together, one that was stronger, built on truth and understanding. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time.